Final Fantasy VIII came at a curious time in the series' history, positioned as it was between Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy IX as part of the PlayStation 1 trifecta, and as such it's reasonably considered as a product of this time. Pre-rendered backgrounds, ATB battle systems, and a neat partition between field screen, battle screen, and overworld screen are the defining features of these three titles that, on the surface at least, links them together as a unique era within the overall anthology. And yet, if we drill down into the particulars of UI design, some of the flourishes that Final Fantasy VIII explored, it could be seen as a forerunner or pioneer for the sorts of player experiences and design decisions for Final Fantasy games that came later. So what are these small but important elements that Final Fantasy VIII added? Why are they comparatively overlooked compared to later titles? And how did it chart the course for the future of Final Fantasy games? Jumping right in, it's commonly cited that FF8's glossy futurism and high-tech aesthetic make it very distinct for the time, and where Final Fantasy VI and VII had this rather dystopian decay about their technology, and Final Fantasy IX was a throwback to the medieval knights and wizards vibes of the earliest games, Final Fantasy VIII's setting arguably has more in common with the likes of Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy XV, which would come over a decade later and leaned equally into the metallic sheen of modern cities. But beyond simply the choice of setting, Final Fantasy VIII also, and I think much more importantly, was the first game to explore the possibility of figurative realism and realistically proportioned characters in any Final Fantasy game. This is often overlooked perhaps because Final Fantasy IX by its nature as a nostalgia piece was a bump in a road that might otherwise have been a very clear visual trajectory and evolution of on-screen character designs towards realism, because clearly in a departure from what Final Fantasy VIII was doing, Final Fantasy IX resolved as a sort of evolution or throwback to the chibi style designs of the early games, where the character's head is proportionately bigger than the body, and it merged this with the super deformed 3D style of Final Fantasy VII, which accented appendages like the hands and feet of characters. So 9 was a very unique take on character designs that perhaps overshadowed the changes that Final Fantasy VIII was moving towards in the chronology of the series. For its part, Final Fantasy VIII, right down to its very concept art and character designs, was leaning towards realism in its execution. And while Toshiyuki Itahana put this Saturday morning cartoon World of Richard Scarry spin on Final Fantasy IX's characters, and Tetsuya Nomura employed a more classically manga sort of style for the designs of Final Fantasy VII's characters, his work on Final Fantasy VIII was more akin to life drawing than anything else, with high fidelity shading and features sketched out for the character portraits of Squall Leonhart, Rinoa Hartley, and each of the game's central characters. The fidelity of these character designs were worked into the final game, with Square's first furtive step towards realistic proportions, and indeed, while looking back today, we can see what amounts to slightly blocky limbs, classic of the PS1 era, and somewhat humorously elongated legs and elongated necks in the field graphics and the Nomura portraits respectively. The execution was ultimately revelatory and a huge boon to the appeal of Final Fantasy VIII for players like myself who felt the game and characters were that much more relatable, more realistic and more tangible owing to the focus on realistic character design. The second pioneering aspect of game design in Final Fantasy VIII, which was also purely cosmetic and somewhat subtle in the scheme of things, is the fact that our party members are present while we traverse around on the field screen, running around as they do behind the player character of Squall. Now, as I say, this is purely a cosmetic feature. You can't interact with or talk to your party members as they follow you, but it was in stark contrast to earlier Final Fantasies and the other two games of the PS1 era, where your party members, after a cutscene or bit of dialogue, would collide into the player character avatar and disappear, and we are left to run around as a singular figure, whether that's Cloud or Zidane or whatever. And indeed, there's amusing self-aware little moments in the games such as in Final Fantasy VII, where Cait Sith insists on joining our party at the Gold Saucer, and then marches into a rather harassed-looking Cloud Strife, seemingly against his will. So, not necessarily bad design, of course, but very much one of the curious features of JRPGs that made one suspend their disbelief and need to get on board with the more abstract elements of the games. Final Fantasy VIII made strides in handling party members more realistically. Again, it's a product of the time, so a little bit janky seeing them run around in this uniform line behind Squall, but it was certainly a huge nod towards the ambition and the direction of travel that future Final Fantasies would be heading in, and once more, it does perhaps show how Final Fantasy VIII might have more in common with the likes of Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy XV than it does with its contemporaries of the PS1 era. So, the pursuit of realism shone through in these two essential factors that, while discreet, do subtly add a lot to our impression of Final Fantasy VIII, I think. Running around towns with the solitary avatar of a stoic, moody Squall for the entire game, rather than showing his enthused and encouraged party members in tow, might have created an entirely different impression of Final Fantasy VIII, something a bit more isolated perhaps, rather than a collective journey that shows Squall's growth as a leader in both overt and subtle ways. Likewise, Final Fantasy VIII's pursuit of figurative character designs really assisted one in emoting with the story of a blossoming romance, the geopolitics, and the high school drama that, with the more super deformed style of Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy IX, might have come across as a little more janky, a little less believable perhaps. In all, Final Fantasy VIII rolled the dice on cosmetic aspects of game design that really pushed the envelope within the limitations of the PlayStation 1, that the next generation, starting with Final Fantasy X, would pick up and run with as standard for their character renders. And indeed, on the note of Final Fantasy X, I think we could argue, in some respects, that it stole Final Fantasy VIII's thunder, being the new shiny game that was next generation, published on the PlayStation 2, almost made people forget that figurative realism had been explored already in the prior game, Final Fantasy VIII. It was, I think, sound design decisions, and it really complemented the world and story that Final Fantasy VIII was trying to tell, and subtly contributed to the impressions that players have of the game to this day. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon, or if you'd like to buy me a coffee, you can do so, the links are available below.